Why did a dying pup choose the one woman who couldn't even scream for help? In the year 1024, in a kingdom where your howl determined your worth, Hestia's silence wasn't just a disability, it was a death sentence. And the Alpha King who kills traitors on sight, you won't believe what sleeps in her bloodline. Before we dive into Hestia's nightmare, you need to understand the brutal social structure of werewolf packs in the Northern Reach. Unlike modern pack dynamics, the medieval hierarchy was absolute and unforgiving. At the top, the Alpha, whose word was law. Below them, Beta warriors, the enforcers and hunters. Then, Deltas, craftsmen and providers. At the very bottom, Omegas, the caretakers and servants. But Hestia, she ranked below even that. A mute Omega was considered defective bloodline, a genetic failure in a society that valued the territorial howl above all else. In their world, if you couldn't announce your presence, defend your claim, or call for your pack, you were already dead. Keep this in mind, because what happens to her will shatter every rule they believe in. The Ironclaw pack house was a fortress of gray stone and colder hearts. Hestia moved through its drafty halls like smoke, present but ignored, essential but invisible. They called her the ghost of the kitchens, and the name fit. She wore a tattered wool cloak stained black with soot and grease, her dark hair always tied back in a fraying braid. Her hands were scarred from years of scrubbing iron pots and hauling buckets of frozen water from the well. She had lost her voice at age 7. A fever had ravaged the children's quarters that winter, and while others recovered, Hestia woke to find that her scream made no sound. The pack healer declared her broken, and her fate was sealed. Silence in the world of wolves was surrender. Every morning she woke before dawn to stoke the fires. Every night she collapsed on a thin mat in the corner of the scullery, her fingers bleeding, her back aching. And every single day, Alpha Silas made sure she remembered exactly what she was. Alpha Silas was a man who wore power like a second skin. Broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, he ruled the Ironclaw pack with an iron fist and a crueler tongue. He didn't just lead, he dominated, and his favorite target? The girl who couldn't talk back. "Look at her," Silas would sneer during the communal meals, his voice booming across the great hall. "The ghost thinks she can eat with her betters." Laughter erupted. Warriors pounded their fists on the tables. Hestia would lower her gaze, her jaw tight, and return to the kitchens without a plate. One winter evening, Silas kicked over her bucket of washwater just as she was finishing the floors. The scalding liquid splashed across the stone, hours of work destroyed in seconds. "Clean it again," he commanded, "and this time thank me for giving you purpose." She couldn't, so he made her kneel in the freezing puddle until her knees went numb. The other Omegas watched, but said nothing. In the Ironclaw pack, challenging the Alpha meant exile, or worse. Hestia learned early that mercy was a myth, and justice didn't exist for girls who couldn't howl. It was on the night of the Winter's Descent feast that everything changed. The great hall roared with firelight and drunken song. Slabs of roasted boar glistened on wooden platters. Mead flowed in rivers. The warriors celebrated another year of dominance over the weaker packs of the north. Hestia worked in the shadows, refilling cups, clearing bones, avoiding eye contact. Then Silas stood. The hall fell silent. "Brothers," he bellowed, raising his cup, "the great frost comes tomorrow, the coldest night in a decade." His yellow eyes gleamed. "Only the strong will survive. Let the weak learn what winter really means." Cheers shook the rafters. Hestia felt a shadow fall over her. Silas looked down, his lips curling into a grin that made her blood run cold. "You, ghost," he said softly so only she could hear, "you'll be gathering peat from the eastern woods tomorrow, alone. Consider it a test of your value." Her heart slammed against her ribs. The eastern woods? In a blizzard? Alone? He wasn't testing her, he was sentencing her to die. If you think Hestia's nightmare ends here, you're wrong. What she's about to find in that frozen forest will make Silas wish he'd shown her mercy. Drop a wolf in the comments if you think she survives the coldest night. And if you're already hooked, smash that like button because this story is about to get wild.
Dawn came like a knife. The great frost descended on the northern reach with the weight of 1,000 winters. Hestia woke to find ice crystals spreading across the inside of the scullery windows, delicate and deadly. The air itself felt sharp enough to cut skin. Outside, the wind didn't howl, it screamed, a relentless banshee wail that rattled the shutters and clawed at the stone walls. She wrapped herself in her threadbare cloak and stepped into the courtyard. The cold hit her like a physical blow. Her first breath seared her lungs, the frozen air burning down her throat like liquid fire. Snow fell in thick, chaotic sheets, erasing the world beyond 10 paces. The pine forests surrounding the pack house had become ghostly silhouettes, skeletal and forbidding. Inside the great hall, she could hear the warriors. Their laughter boomed through the thick oak doors. The scent of roasted meat and mulled wine wafted out into the bitter morning. They were celebrating the frost like it was a festival, another conquest to add to their legend. But Hestia had been given her orders. The eastern woods, alone, for Pete. She looked at the tree line and felt her stomach twist. The eastern woods were 3 miles through unbroken snow. The peat bogs were frozen solid this time of year. Silas knew that. Everyone knew that. This wasn't a task. It was an execution dressed up as duty. She tightened the ties on her cloak and picked up the wicker gathering basket. No one stopped her. No one even looked. The stable boy walked past her like she was part of the architecture. The sentries at the gate didn't acknowledge her existence. If she died out there, it would be days before anyone noticed, and when they did, they'd shrug and say the ghost finally disappeared for good. Hestia stepped beyond the walls. The storm swallowed her whole. The snow was thigh-deep in places, sometimes higher. Each step was a battle. She pushed forward, her legs burning with effort, her hands already numb, despite the wool mittens. The wind tore at her cloak, whipping her braid against her face. Ice clung to her eyelashes. Her breath came in short, desperate gasps, each one a white cloud that vanished instantly into the gray void. Sound died in the snow. The world became eerily silent, except for the wind, a low, constant roar that filled her ears and her skull. She couldn't hear her own footsteps, couldn't hear the creak of the basket on her back. It was like being buried alive in frozen cotton. She thought about turning back, but where would she go? Back to Silas? Back to the kitchens where they'd mock her for failing even this? No. If she was going to die, it would be out here, on her terms. Alone, yes, but free from their eyes, their laughter, their cruelty. She pushed deeper into the forest. The trees closed in around her, their branches heavy with snow and ice. The world narrowed to a tunnel of white and gray. Her fingers lost all feeling. Her toes went numb inside her worn boots. She stumbled over a hidden root and fell forward, catching herself on a frozen log. Pain shot through her wrists. She stayed there for a moment, kneeling in the snow, wondering if this was it, if she should just close her eyes and let the cold take her. Then she heard it. A sound. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Not the wind, not the creak of ice-laden branches. A cry. High-pitched, desperate, alive. Hestia's head snapped up. Her heart, sluggish from the cold, suddenly slammed against her ribs. She turned toward the sound, squinting through the snowfall. There, to the east, deeper into the woods. Something was out there, something that needed help. Hestia didn't think. She moved. Her body protested every step, but she pushed through the pain, following the sound. It came again, a thin, wavering whimper that cut through the storm like a beacon. Not human, not fully wolf either, something in between. She crashed through a thicket of frozen briars, the thorns catching on her cloak and scratching her hands. Blood welled up in thin lines across her knuckles, but she barely felt it. The cold had stolen most sensation from her extremities. The crying grew louder, closer. Hestia rounded a massive dead oak, its hollow trunk split open by lightning years ago, and stopped dead. There, curled in the hollow of the tree, was a wolf pup, but not just any pup. He was pure white, his fur almost luminescent against the dark wood and gray snow. Even in the dim stormlight, he seemed to glow. His body trembled so violently that his whole form appeared to vibrate. Ice crystals clung to his nose and the tips of his ears. His blue eyes, impossibly blue, like summer sky trapped in winter, locked onto hers. And he cried. Hestia's breast caught. She knew what he was, even without the mark, even without the confirmation. She knew. This wasn't a common wolf. The white coat, the size, even as a pup, the eyes, this was royalty. Her hands moved before her mind could catch up. She dropped to her knees in the snow, ignoring the way the cold soaked through her skirts. She shrugged off her gathering basket and pulled out the rusted brown knit blanket she'd packed, meant to wrap around Pete, now repurposed for something infinitely more precious. The pup whimpered again, his small body shaking so hard she feared he'd break apart. Shh. She tried to whisper, but of course, no sound came. She reached for him slowly, carefully. That's when she heard them. Boots, heavy, multiple pairs, crunching through the snow with military precision. Voices carried on the wind, muffled but unmistakable. Can't have gone far. Kill it before it reaches the border. Alpha's orders. Hunters. Hestia's blood turned to ice colder than the storm around her. They weren't hunting deer or boar. They were hunting him, this pup, this child. She looked down at the tiny white wolf. He stared up at her with those heartbreaking blue eyes. And in that moment, she saw herself, helpless, voiceless, alone, dependent on the mercy of a world that had none to give. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to leave him, to save herself. She'd spent her entire life invisible, beneath notice, beneath consequence. If she took this pup, she would be seen, and being seen in her world meant death. But looking into those eyes, Hestia realized something. She was already dead, had been for years, a ghost, a shadow, barely alive enough to suffer. At least this way, she could mean something. She scooped the pup into her arms, wrapping the blanket around his shivering body. He was heavier than she expected, dense with muscle, even in infancy. She pressed him against her chest, tucking him inside her cloak, sharing what little warmth her body still held. The voices grew closer. Tracks here. Someone's been through. Hestia turned to run, but the snow was too deep. She managed 3 steps before her boot caught on something beneath the surface. She stumbled, barely catching herself. The pup shifted in her arms, trying to burrow deeper into her warmth. His small paw pushed against her chest, then slipped, catching on the collar of her dress. His claws scraped across the bare skin of her collarbone, and the world exploded into gold. Heat. Searing, impossible heat erupted where the pup's paw touched her skin. Not the heat of fire or fever, but something ancient, something that lived in blood and bone and the space between heartbeats. Hestia gasped, a soundless intake of air that froze in her lungs. The pup yelped, a high, startled sound, but he didn't pull away. His paw remained pressed against her skin, and beneath it, something was happening. Light bloomed under his touch, golden light. It spread across her collarbone like liquid fire, racing along invisible pathways, tracing patterns that had no business existing in the mortal world. She tore open her cloak with numb fingers, yanking down the collar of her dress to see. The mark was forming. It started as a formless glow, but with each passing second, it sharpened. Lines emerged, curves, details. The light condensed and solidified, burning itself into her flesh, not as a wound, but as something deeper, something written into her very being. A crowned wolf. The sigil was unmistakable. She'd seen it once before, years ago, when a royal emissary had passed through Ironclaw territory. The mark of the High King's bloodline, the symbol of the High Throne of Wolfram. The mark that appeared only when the heir of the kingdom recognized their true guardian. Hestia stared at it, her mind fracturing under the weight of impossibility. This couldn't be real. She was nobody, less than nobody, a mute omega who scraped pots and slept on kitchen floors. The mark didn't appear on people like her. It appeared on legendary warriors, on noble protectors, on those chosen by destiny itself, not on ghosts. The pup whimpered softly, his blue eyes fixed on her face. In the golden light of the mark, she could see him clearly now, see the intelligence in those eyes, the recognition, the relief. He had chosen her, or something greater than both of them had. Hestia's hands trembled as she pulled the blanket tighter around him. The mark continued to glow, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. It was warm, comforting even, like a hand on her shoulder telling her she wasn't alone. But she was, more alone than ever, because now she understood what she held in her arms. This wasn't just a pup. This was the prince of the blood, the lost heir to the high throne. And if he was here, alone, freezing in the woods while hunters tracked him, the king was dead, or the king thought his son was dead, or someone had made sure everyone believed the king was dead. Treason, assassination, conspiracy. And she, the voiceless girl nobody cared about, had just stumbled into the middle of it. The mark flared brighter, almost blinding in the storm's gray haze. "There!" a voice shouted. Close, too close. Hestia spun around. Through the falling snow, she saw shapes, dark figures emerging from between the trees, 5 of them. No, 6, warriors in winter furs, swords drawn, eyes glowing that predatory yellow. And at the front, pushing through the drifts with the confidence of a man who'd never feared anything in his life, Alpha Silas. His eyes locked onto the golden light blazing from her chest, then onto the white pup in her arms. His face twisted into something between rage and triumph. "Well, well," Silas called out, his voice cutting through the wind. "The ghost grows bold." His warriors fanned out, surrounding her, 6 armed men, 1 mute girl, waist-deep snow in every direction. No escape. Silas took another step forward, close enough now that she could see the cruel pleasure in his eyes. "Give us the beast, Hestia." His voice was silk over steel, soft, deadly. "The High King Wolfram is dead, and his brat must follow him if we are to claim the northern territories." He extended his hand, palm up, waiting. "Hand him over," Silas continued, his smile widening, "and I might let you sleep in the stables tonight instead of freezing to death in the snow." The pup pressed harder against her chest. She felt his tiny heart hammering against her ribs. "Actually," Silas said, tilting his head, "I might let you watch. Would you like that, ghost? Would you like to watch us slit the little prince's throat before we bury you both in the ice?" The mark on her chest pulsed, once, twice, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees, something moved, something much, much larger than a man. The storm itself seemed to hold its breath. Hestia's mind raced through her options like a wolf through a forest. Run, Impossible. The snow was too deep and they'd cut her down before she made it 10 paces. Fight? Laughable. She had no weapon, no voice to call for help, no strength to match even one of these warriors, let alone 6. Surrender? She looked down at the pup. Those blue eyes stared up at her with complete trust. He didn't understand what was happening. He only knew that she was warm and she was safe and she had chosen to protect him when she could have walked away. No, surrender wasn't an option either. Silas took another step forward, his boots crunching through the ice crust. His enforcers moved with him, tightening the circle. They were experienced hunters, she realized. This wasn't their first hunt, probably not even their first royal assassination. "You know what I find fascinating about you, Ghost?" Silas said, conversational now, as if they were discussing the weather over dinner. "You've spent your entire life being invisible, unremarkable, forgotten, and yet here you are, in the middle of the greatest political shift the Northern Reach has seen in 300 years. He gestured at the mark on her chest, still glowing through her torn dress. "That mark," he continued, his voice taking on an edge of genuine curiosity mixed with contempt, "is supposed to appear only on the worthy, on warriors, on those with noble blood and pure hearts." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "But it chose you, a defective mute who scrubs pots and sleeps with the rats." One of his enforcers snickered. Hestia's grip tightened on the pup. The blanket had slipped and she could feel his fur against her skin, soft and warm despite the cold. "Do you want to know the truth, Hestia?" asked Silas, his yellow eyes gleaming. "About what really happened to the great Alpha King Wolfram?" She did. And she didn't, because once she knew, there would be no unknowing, no pretending she hadn't stumbled into something that would get her killed. Silas smiled, reading her silence as permission. "We were hunting in the royal forest 3 days ago, a grand party, 30 of us, the king, his queen, his precious heir." He gestured at the pup. "Everything was perfect, until the ambush." Hestia's stomach dropped. "Bandits, we'll say, northern raiders. Tragic, really. The queen died first, an arrow through the throat, very clean. The king fought like a demon, of course, killed 8 of my men before we brought him down." Silas's voice carried no remorse, only pride. "And the pup? Well, he ran. We tracked him for miles, thought the cold would finish what our blades couldn't." He stepped closer, close enough that Hestia could smell the wine on his breath. "Here's what's going to happen, Hestia," Silas said, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. "You're going to hand me that pup. I'm going to finish what I started, and then you're going to die out here in the snow, another forgotten Omega who couldn't survive the great frost. No one will mourn you, no one will even remember your name." Hestia's breathing came fast and shallow. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through. She shook her head. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable in the storm, but Silas saw it. His expression darkened. "No," he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "You dare refuse your alpha?" She nodded, once, firm. The pup whimpered and pressed tighter against her chest. Silas's hand shot out, grabbing her by the throat. His fingers were like iron, crushing her windpipe. Not that it mattered, she couldn't scream anyway. "Then you'll die first, and I'll take him from your corpse." His other hand reached for the pup, fingers curled into claws, aiming for the small white throat. Hestia twisted, turning her body to shield the pup as Silas's grip tightened on her neck. Black spots danced across her vision. The world narrowed to a tunnel. She was going to die, but the pup wouldn't, not if she could help it, not if her body could be one more barrier between her and those murderous hands. Silas's fingers were inches from the pup's fur when the mark on Hestia's chest exploded with light. The golden light didn't just glow, it detonated. The force of it threw Silas backward, his hand ripped from Hestia's throat. He stumbled, catching himself against a tree, his face twisted in shock and rage. His enforcers raised their weapons, but the light was blinding, turning the gray storm into a blazing nova of gold and white. Hestia fell to her knees, gasping for air. The pup still clutched against her chest. The mark on her skin was burning now, so hot she thought it might sear through to her bones. But it didn't hurt. It felt right, like something ancient and powerful recognizing her, claiming her. The ground beneath her began to tremble. At first, she thought it was just her body shaking from shock and cold, but then the snow started to vibrate. Small tremors rippled outward from where she knelt, growing stronger with each passing second. The trees swayed, ice cracked and fell from the branches in sheets. The storm itself began to shift. The wind changed direction, no longer howling from the north, but swirling, circling, forming a vortex with Hestia at its center. The snowfall slowed, then stopped entirely in a wide radius around her. Beyond that circle, the blizzard continued to rage, but here, in this impossible pocket of calm, the air was still. Silas scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide. What? The words died in his throat. From the darkness between the trees, something moved. No, someone. A figure emerged from the storm, and the world seemed to shrink in his presence. He was massive, easily 7 feet tall, wrapped in charcoal gray furs and iron plates that looked like they'd been forged in dragon fire. His hair was black as midnight, streaked with silver, pulled back from a face that could have been carved from stone. But it was his eyes that stopped Hestia's heart. They weren't yellow like a common wolf's. They weren't even gold like the royal bloodlines. They were violet, deep, piercing, ancient violet, the color of kings, the color of gods. Alpha King Wolfram. He was alive. Silas's face went white as fresh snow. His mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. Behind him, his enforcers took an involuntary step backward. My king, Silas stammered. We thought— You thought you'd killed me, Wolfram said. His voice was a low rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. It wasn't loud, but it carried absolute authority. The kind of voice that made men kneel without thinking, that made wolves bare their throats in submission. Silas dropped to one knee. His enforcers followed, though their eyes darted toward the tree line, calculating escape routes. No, my king, Silas said, his voice taking on a desperate, wheedling quality. There was an ambush, northern raiders. I've been searching for your son ever since. I tracked him to this forest and found this girl trying to steal him. Wolfram's gaze shifted to Hestia. She was still kneeling in the snow, the pup in her arms, the golden mark blazing on her chest. Her throat was bruised where Silas had grabbed her. Her dress was torn. Her hair had come loose from its braid, wild around her face. She looked like exactly what she was, a terrified Omega who had no idea what was happening. But she met the king's eyes, and she didn't look away. Wolfram took a step forward, then another, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. Silas remained kneeling, his head bowed, but Hestia could see the tension in her shoulders, the way his hand inched toward the dagger at his belt. The king stopped 3 paces from Hestia. This close, he was even more imposing. The scars on his face told stories of 100 battles. The violet eyes held the weight of centuries of bloodline and power. He looked at the mark on her chest, then at the pup in her arms. The small white wolf, his son, let out a tiny bark and wriggled free from the blanket. Before Hestia could stop him, the pup launched himself toward Wolfram, landing in the snow and bounding forward on unsteady legs. "Kale," Wolfram whispered, and for the first time, his voice broke. He dropped to one knee, and the pup crashed into his chest. The king wrapped his arms around his son, burying his face in the white fur, his massive shoulders shaking.
Hestia's eyes burned. She didn't know if it was from the cold or something else. When Wolfram looked up, his eyes were wet. "The mark of the guardian," he said, his gaze returning to Hestia, "only appears to those with a heart of pure sacrifice. It cannot be faked, it cannot be stolen, and it certainly would not appear on the arm of a thief." He stood, still holding the pup, Kale, against his chest. Behind him, Silas's face twisted with fury and fear. Wolfram turned to face the traitor, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. "You speak of northern raiders," the king said softly, "but I killed the raiders, all of them, 3 days ago, just as you said, and then I tracked my son through the storm, hidden by the very blizzard you thought would cover your treason." Silas's hand closed around his dagger. "Don't," Wolfram said. It wasn't a warning, it was a fact. But Silas was past listening. He lunged, the blade flashing toward the king's throat. He made it exactly 2 steps before Wolfram moved. The king was faster than anything that size had a right to be. His hand shot out, catching Silas by the wrist, stopping the blade mid-strike. Bone cracked. Silas screamed. Wolfram twisted, and Silas hit the ground hard enough to crack ice. "You killed my queen," Wolfram said, his voice like grinding stone. "You tried to kill my son. You conspired with my enemies and betrayed every oath you ever swore." Silas tried to crawl away. Wolfram placed one massive boot on his back, pinning him to the frozen earth. "And yet," the king continued, turning to look at Hestia again, "this girl, this Omega you treated as less than nothing, risked everything to save my bloodline." He lifted his foot. Then, impossibly, the Alpha King of the Northern Reach, the most powerful wolf in 1,000 miles, knelt in the snow before her.
Hestia couldn't breathe. The king of the Northern Reach was kneeling before her, in the snow, in front of his warriors, his enemies, the entire world. A king bowed to no one except the gods themselves, and even then, only in prayer. But here he was. "You saved my son," Wolfram said quietly. "You saved my lineage. Ask for anything, and it is yours. Gold, land, titles, the heads of those who wronged you." His violet eyes held hers. "Name it, and I will give it to you." Anything. The word echoed in Hestia's mind like thunder. She could ask for wealth beyond imagining. She could demand that Silas and every person who had ever tormented her be executed on the spot. She could request a place at court, power, respect, everything she'd never had. She opened her mouth. No sound came out. The old instinct, the old wound, her voice, stolen by fever all those years ago, remained silent even now. Even with the mark of the guardian burning on her chest, even with the king of the realm kneeling before her, she was still the mute Omega who couldn't speak. Frustration and shame burned through her. This was her moment, the one chance to be heard, to matter, to claim what was owed. And she couldn't say a single word. The pup, Kale, squirmed in his father's arms, looking between them. His blue eyes were so intelligent, so aware. He made a small sound, almost questioning. Then he wriggled free. Wolfram started to catch him, but Kale was determined. The small white pup padded through the snow, his paws sinking with each step, until he reached Hestia. He looked up at her, tail wagging, and placed one small paw on her knee. The mark on her chest pulsed, warm, insistent, alive. Hestia looked down at Kale, at this tiny creature who had chosen her in the hollow of that dead oak, who had given her a mark that declared her worthy when the entire world had declared her worthless. She thought about Silas, about the years of abuse, the humiliation, the casual cruelty of those who had power over her. She thought about all the Omegas still in the Ironclaw packhouse, voiceless in their own ways, suffering under the same system that had crushed her. She thought about mercy, real mercy, not the kind that came from weakness or fear, but the kind that came from understanding suffering so deeply that you refused to inflict it on others. The mark pulsed again, stronger this time. The warmth spread from her chest up to her throat, tingling, gathering, building into something she could feel but not yet name. Wolfram was still kneeling, patient. The snow began to fall again, soft flakes landing on his dark hair, on Cale's white fur, on Hestia's trembling hands. Behind the king, Silas lay in the snow where he'd fallen, surrounded by Wolfram's warriors who had emerged from the forest like shadows. The former Alpha's face was a mask of hatred and terror, his eyes fixed on Hestia with the kind of loathing that came from being bested by the one you deemed beneath contempt. Hestia looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel small. She felt powerful. Not because of the mark, though it blazed bright enough to cast shadows in the storm. Not because the king knelt before her, though that too was extraordinary. She felt powerful because she had a choice, and she knew, with absolute clarity, what that choice would be. The mark flared brilliant gold, so bright that everyone shielded their eyes. The warmth in her throat intensified, became heat, became fire, not burning, transforming. Cale barked once, sharp and clear, his tail wagging frantically, and Hestia felt something unlock inside her, something ancient and primal and absolutely terrifying. Her throat, silent for so many years, suddenly felt full, as if words were pooling there, gathering strength, waiting for permission to be born. The light from the mark surged upward, flowing like liquid sunshine from her chest, along her collarbone, up the column of her neck. Wolfram's eyes widened. He started to stand, but something held him in place. Reverence, perhaps, or recognition of something sacred unfolding. Hestia's lips parted. The words were right there, right on the edge of existence. After 13 years of silence, she was about to speak. Her first words, and the entire world seemed to lean in. "I do not want their heads." The voice that came from Hestia's throat was not the weak, uncertain sound of a girl who'd never spoken. It was melodic and resonant, carrying across the frozen forest like a bell struck in a cathedral. Each word rang with clarity and power, vibrating in the bones of everyone who heard it. Wolfram's eyes widened. Silas, still pinned in the snow by the king's warriors, went completely still. Hestia's hand flew to her throat, her eyes huge with shock. That was her voice. Her voice. After 13 years of silence, of frustration, of words trapped behind a barrier she could never break, she had spoken. The mark on her chest pulsed once more, then settled into a steady, warm glow. The golden light dimmed, but didn't disappear, now a constant presence rather than an explosive force. "The voice of the sovereign," Wolfram whispered, and there was awe in his tone. The gift reserved for the true mate of a king. Hestia looked at him, questions flooding her mind faster than she could form them. True mate? What did that mean? She'd saved a pup in the snow. That was all. But Cale was pressing against her leg, his small body warm and solid, and the mark was glowing, and her voice was real. She turned her attention to Silas. The former Alpha of Ironclaw was staring at her with something beyond hatred. It was disbelief mixed with primal terror. The natural order of his world had inverted. The girl he'd tormented, the voiceless Omega he'd considered less than dirt, was now standing before him with the mark of a guardian, the voice of sovereignty, and the king of the Northern Reach at her side. "I want them to live," Hestia said, and her voice didn't waver. Silas's face twisted with confusion. Hope flickered in his eyes, brief and pathetic. Hestia stepped forward. The snow crunched under her worn boots. Kale followed, staying close to her leg like a tiny white shadow. She stopped a few paces from where Silas knelt, flanked by Wolfram's warriors. I want them to live as I lived, her gaze sweeping across Silas and his enforcers. I want them to know what it means to be powerless, to be voiceless, to depend on the mercy of others who have none to give. Understanding dawned on Silas's face. The hope died, replaced by horror. No, he breathed. Strip them of their ranks, their titles, and their territory, Hestia said, and though she spoke quietly, her words carried absolute authority. Take their voices, let them wander the north as Omegas, dependent on the charity of those they once despised. Her eyes locked onto Silas, and in them was not cruelty, but something far more devastating, justice tempered with understanding. Let them learn, she said, that power is not found in the howl, but in the protection of the helpless. Let them discover that the quietest voice in the room can also be the strongest. Let them feel what I felt, and perhaps, in time, they might become something better than what they are now. Silence fell across the forest. Even the wind seemed to pause. Wolfram stood slowly, Kale cradled in one massive arm. He looked at Hestia with an expression that was part admiration, part something deeper, something that made her heart skip. "You offer them mercy," he said. "I offer them education," Hestia corrected. "Whether they learn from it is their choice." The king turned to face Silas and the 6 enforcers kneeling in the snow. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of absolute law. "By the ancient rights of the High King, by the bond of the guardian Mark, and by the voice of the sovereign herself," he gestured to Hestia. "Then I pronounce this sentence." He raised his hand, and violet light began to gather around his fingers. Not gold like Hestia's mark, but the deep purple of royal blood and ancient magic. "Silas of Ironclaw, you are hereby stripped of your rank, your titles, and your territory. Your enforcers share your fate." The light grew brighter. "And by the power vested in me by the bloodline of kings, I bind your tongues. You will walk this world as Omegas, voiceless and dependent, until such time as you prove yourselves worthy of redemption." Silas opened his mouth to protest, to plead, to curse. No sound emerged. His eyes went wide with panic. He tried again, his throat working, his mouth forming words, but nothing came out except a thin wheeze of air. The enforcers experienced the same realization. One by one, they touched their throats, opened their mouths, and found only silence. The same silence Hestia had endured for 13 years. Wolfram lowered his hand. The violet light faded. "Take them," he commanded his warriors. "Strip them of their weapons and armor. Give each a cloak and provisions for 3 days, then escort them to the border of Ironclaw territory and cast them out." The warriors moved immediately, hauling Silas and his men to their feet. Silas struggled, his mouth moving frantically, trying desperately to speak, to command, to threaten, but he was just a mute man now, powerless, voiceless, invisible. As they were dragged away into the storm, Silas looked back one final time. His eyes met Hestia's, and in them she saw the beginning of understanding, the first terrible glimpse of what he had done to her reflected back through his own experience. Whether he would learn from it remained to be seen, but at least now he would know. The forest fell silent, except for the whisper of falling snow. Hestia stood alone with the king and his son, her breath forming white clouds in the frozen air. The mark on her chest had dimmed to a soft golden glow, visible through her torn dress. Her throat still tingled with the newness of speech, each swallow a reminder that she could make sounds, form words, be heard. Wolfram's warriors emerged fully from the tree line now that the immediate danger had passed. There were at least 20 of them, she realized, all armed and armored, all watching her with expressions ranging from curiosity to reverence. She became acutely aware of what she must look like. Her dress was torn and stained with soot and blood. Her cloak was threadbare and soaked through with melted snow. Her hair hung loose and wild around her face. She was everything she'd always been, a poor Omega with nothing to her name. Except now she had a voice, and the mark of a guardian, and the attention of a king. "What is your name?" Wolfram asked quietly. "Hestia," she said, and the sound of her own name and her own voice nearly broke her. She'd never spoken it before, never introduced herself. Others had always spoken for her, about her, around her. "Hestia," Wolfram repeated, as if tasting the word. "Do you know what you've done today?" She looked down at Cale, who was watching her with those impossibly blue eyes. "I saved a child." "You saved the heir to the Northern Reach," Wolfram corrected. "You saved my bloodline, my kingdom, my world." He shifted Cale in his arms and took a step closer to her. "The mark of the guardian is not given lightly. It appears only when the royal blood recognizes someone willing to sacrifice everything for its protection, someone pure of heart and strong of spirit." His violet eyes held hers. "And the voice of the sovereign, that gift is rarer still. It marks you as your true mate," a warrior said from behind them, an older man with gray in his beard and scars mapping his face. "The legends speak of it. When the mark appears and the voice is given, the bond is sealed." Hestia's heart stuttered. True mate. The concept was almost mythical. A bond deeper than marriage, stronger than pack loyalty. Two souls recognized by magic itself as belonging together. She barely knew this man. But looking at him now, at the way he held his son, at the grief still visible in his eyes for his lost queen, at the respect he showed her despite her station, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not love, not yet, but the potential for it, the recognition of someone who understood loss and loneliness and the weight of responsibility. "I am not asking you to accept the bond, not now, not until you're ready, if ever, but I am asking you to return with us to the capital." Hestia hesitated. The capital, the High Court, a world so far removed from her own that she couldn't even imagine it. "You would be safe there, honored, given chambers befitting your station. You could heal, learn to use your voice, discover who you are beyond the suffering Ironclaw inflicted on you." It was tempting, so tempting, to leave behind the pack house and its cruelty, to never scrub another pot or sleep on another cold floor. But something in her hesitated. The other Omegas, at Ironclaw, they're still there, still suffering under those who remain. Wolfram's expression hardened. "Ironclaw territory will be absorbed into the Crown lands. I will send administrators to oversee it until proper leadership can be established. Any Omega who wishes to leave will be given safe passage and new positions." "And those who stay?" "Will be protected under Crown law," Wolfram promised. "I give you my word as king." Hestia searched his face and found only sincerity. This was a man who kept his promises. She took a breath, still marveling at the sensation of drawing air to speak, and nodded. "Then I will come with you." Wolfram's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if he'd been holding tension she hadn't noticed. "Thank you." He turned to his warriors. "We return to the capital. Send word ahead that the prince lives and that he owes his life to—" He paused, looking back at Hestia. "To Lady Hestia, guardian of the royal blood and voice of the sovereign." Lady. Not Omega, not servant, not ghost. Lady. The title settled over her like a cloak, warm and unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Kale squirmed in his father's arms and barked, a tiny, imperious sound. Wolfram smiled, a rare softening of his severe features, and set the pup down. Kale immediately bounded through the snow to Hestia, circling her legs and yipping happily. "He won't leave your side," Wolfram observed. "The bond is strong." Hestia knelt down, and Kale jumped into her arms, licking her face with puppy enthusiasm. Despite everything, the cold, the fear, the overwhelming strangeness of her new reality, she laughed. The sound was bright and clear and utterly free. And in that moment, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, her life had truly changed. 3 months later, Hestia stood on the balcony of the Northern Palace and watched the sun rise over the capital city of Wolfholm. The palace was nothing like the Ironclaw packhouse. Where that had been gray stone and cold corners, this was white marble and soaring towers. Tapestries lined the halls depicting centuries of wolf history. Fires burned warm in every hearth, and her chambers, were larger than the entire kitchen where she'd once slept. She wore a gown of deep blue wool trimmed with silver thread, her hair braided with small pearls woven through the strands. The mark of the guardian was visible on her collarbone, no longer hidden but displayed as a symbol of her station. Lady Hestia, guardian of the royal blood, voice of the sovereign, and, as of 2 weeks ago, Queen Regent of the Northern Reach. The title still felt strange. She hadn't sought it, hadn't even fully understood what was happening when the Council of Elders had presented her with the silver circlet and declared that until Prince Kale came of age, she would rule alongside King Wolfram. "You saved the heir," the eldest council member had said. "You bear his mark. You speak with the voice of authority. The realm trusts you to protect what matters most." Wolfram had knelt before her again, this time in the throne room before the entire court, and offered her the circlet himself. "Will you stand with me?" he'd asked. "Will you help me build a kingdom where the voiceless are heard and the powerless are protected?" She'd looked into his violet eyes and seen not obligation, but hope, not a king seeking a political alliance, but a man asking a woman he was beginning to love to share his burden. And she'd said yes. The coronation had been simple by royal standards. She'd requested no grand ceremony, no weeks of celebration, just the circlet, the vows, and the quiet knowledge that she would spend the rest of her life ensuring no one else suffered as she had. Since then, her days had been full. She attended council meetings, her voice carrying weight in discussions of law and justice. She established new protections for Omegas across the realm, laws that guaranteed basic rights, prevented abuse, and created pathways for advancement regardless of rank. The nobles had resisted at first. Change always met resistance. But when Hestia spoke, they listened. Not because she shouted or threatened, not because she wielded power like a weapon. They listened because when the queen who had lived in silence finally spoke, her words carried the authority of lived truth. "Your Majesty?" Hestia turned to find Wolfram stepping onto the balcony. Kale padded at his heels, no longer a tiny pup, but a young wolf the size of a large dog. He was still pure white, still had those striking blue eyes, and still followed Hestia everywhere she went. "Just Hestia," she said, as she always did. "Please." Wolfram smiled. Over the past 3 months, she'd learned to read his expressions. This smile was the genuine one, the one reserved for moments when the weight of the crown lifted slightly. "The council has approved your proposal," he said, joining her at the railing. "The Omega Protection Act will be enacted across all territories by winter's end." Relief flooded through her. That act had been her primary focus since taking the throne, a comprehensive law that would fundamentally change how Omegas were treated throughout the realm. "Thank you," she said. "You did this," Wolfram replied. "I merely supported it." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city wake below. Merchants opening shops, children running through streets, life continuing in all its messy, beautiful complexity. "Do you ever regret it?" asked Wolfram quietly, "leaving behind the simple life?" Hestia considered the question. Did she miss the simplicity of knowing her place, of having no expectations, no responsibilities? No, because that simplicity was a cage, silence as a death sentence, invisibility as survival. "I regret nothing," she said, "though sometimes I wonder what happened to them." She didn't need to specify who. Wolfram knew she meant Silas and his men. "Reports come in occasionally," he said. "They're alive, surviving, working as laborers in the southern territories. They cannot speak, cannot reclaim their former ranks. Some have learned humility, others remain bitter. But they live," she said, "because you gave them mercy when they deserved none." She looked at him. Everyone deserves a chance to become better than they are. Even if they never take it, they deserve the chance. Wolfram reached out and took her hand. His palm was warm, calloused from sword work, gentle despite his strength. "You are wiser than any ruler I have known," he said softly. "I simply remember what it felt like to be powerless, and I refuse to inflict that on others." Kale chose that moment to wedge himself between them, demanding attention. They both laughed, and Hestia knelt to scratch behind his ears. He'd grown, but in many ways, he was still the tiny pup she'd found freezing in the snow. The pup who had changed everything. Below them, the city continued its morning routines. People who would never know that their queen had once scrubbed pots and slept on kitchen floors. People who would never understand how far she'd come. But that was all right. She didn't need them to know her past. She only needed them to benefit from the lessons it had taught her. True power, she had learned, was not the ability to silence others. It was the courage to protect those who had no voice, the wisdom to listen to the quietest whispers, and the strength to ensure that everyone had the chance to speak. Hestia, the girl who had once been invisible, now stood as queen, and when she spoke, the entire kingdom listened. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters. Drop a comment telling us what you'd do if you were given the power to bring justice to those who wronged you. Would you choose vengeance or mercy? And subscribe, because we have more stories of underdogs rising to destiny coming your way. Remember, true strength isn't found in the loudest roar, but in the courage to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Until next time, may you find your voice and use it wisely.